Hello.
Hello, Roshni. Good afternoon.
Yeah, it's afternoon here. It's morning.
Yes, it is morning here in the United States. So, yeah, it's nice here. Where in France are you? You're in France, correct?
Yes, French Riviera. It's like Nice around that area.
Perfect. That's beautiful. Very beautiful. You made a good choice.
Yeah, yeah. They say like destiny brings you to the place that you were meant to actually. I felt like this was my place when I came here.
Yeah, I think it's beautiful. My family, at least half my family, originally is from the Barcelona region. In
Mm.
right on the coast there, and they emigrated to Cuba in around World War II, and then came to the United States later. So it's familiar with that area of the world generally. I can't wait to get back there, but for us Americans, they don't let us travel for good reason. We're there are probably not a good idea to let too many people, just as the subject of our discussion today.
Yes.
Uh, it can be difficult to let people travel when there's a pandemic going on.
Yeah, I understand that. You can start by telling more about yourself. Yeah, we can start. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, I take it you'll edit out some
Yes.
of the beginning part.
Yes.
That's totally fine. Uh, yeah, I'm Jason Voiovich, and I've been in product development and launching new products my entire career, almost 25 years now. And most recently, I'm the author of Marketer in Chief: How Each President Sold the American Idea. And really, the whole idea behind that was really to understand how presidential history, uh, how we could understand presidential history from a kind of marketing and innovation and branding perspective. And what new insights could we gather, not only about presidential history, but about what challenges we face today? And what can we learn that will help us not repeat some of the mistakes that we've made in the past? And how do we make things better in the future? And one of the most interesting stories in the book that's most relevant for us globally today is really the story of Woodrow Wilson and the 1918 flu pandemic, where the president at that time needed to deal with a war, World War One, the emergence of the League of Nations and a new global order, as well as a devastating pandemic all at the same time, with real lessons for today's COVID-19 pandemic, which we are still, as we record this, as we are still deep in the middle of right now. What we learned from there to here there are surprising parallels between the two.
Yes, and also I need to add that the first flu vaccine was actually released in the 1940s, and it was developed by Thomas Francis Jr. And Jonas Salk, and they are all MD holders. And the thing is that they took a significant amount of time to actually develop it by isolating the virus from the patients itself back in during the pandemic itself.
It was really fascinating to learn about some of that history as well, that during the time the epidemiologists and the physicians really had limited treatment options. They didn't really know what was going on. There was a lot of confusion. There are great books on that I reference in my book. The Great Influenza is one in particular that I think is fascinating for the average reader. But what was clear in there from my reading, and I suspect from yours as well, is that the physicians had very little knowledge of what was going on, but they also knew that the science of epidemiology and germ theory of disease, there were some of the pioneering physicians at that time who knew we don't know yet how we're going to solve this. but we know we will in the future. So they worked tirelessly to capture samples from live patients and patients who passed away, so that in the future,
Yes.
we could work on vaccines, and we could work on having some mitigation strategies for the flu, which was just, it's a fantastic read. It is a great way to, I think it's a great way to pass the time.
Yes.
I love it. And that's what originally, it was the Great Influenza, that book, that originally gave me the idea to look at President Wilson's strategy in that regard, because some of that is covered in the book.
Yes. Can you speak about that more in detail and how he actually um, kind of used his like strategies to kind of deal with the pandemic?
Yeah, that's what's interesting about the Wilson strategy in the pandemic is how similar it is to some of the initial strategies in 2020 as the COVID-19 pandemic was beginning to take shape. At the time, President Wilson was very concerned about essentially readiness of the American ability to supply troops to the European theater in World War I, and any information that would be detrimental to that, or that not the Axis powers at that time, or the Central powers in World War I, Germany and their allies, if anyone found out anything that said, oh, there's a pandemic going on in the United States, and that might prevent troops from coming over, that was a competitive advantage in the war. Just like bullets and troops and tanks and all of those things, information was a weapon. So what Wilson's administration did is they clamped down on information on what was going on. And they weren't the only ones. France did, Germany did, Great Britain did as well. The one that didn't was Spain. Spain did not clamp down on information. They published their information like good scientists. And what they got for their publishing was it named the Spanish flu. And it was named the Spanish flu for almost 100 years. People saw it. And when you read about it in textbooks from the 1970s and 80s, it's still called the Spanish flu. So Wilson's strategy, in a word, was containment. How do we not talk about it and just not share information about that's going on? The problem is that pandemics don't care, viruses don't care what our strategy is. And when soldiers started landing in Boston and then moved to Philadelphia, the outbreak broke out, very strongly in those cities, and all of those kind of minimizations and lies and obfuscations all kind of fell away, and that's what began to generate the panic at that time. And once that set in, it was very difficult for the presidential administration to control what was going on at that time. It was, they weren't able to, and when 25% of the population of Philadelphia was sick, it was very difficult to tell people that nothing was going on and that everything was okay. So it's Wilson's strategy essentially was very similar to the strategy in the United States, at least in the COVID-19 pandemic, where trying to minimize the severity, trying to kind of say nothing's going on, or hey, it'll all be fine in a couple of months. In stark contrast in 2020 to the strategy used by the European Union, by China, and by especially most notably Australia and New Zealand, to take the pandemic seriously, contain it, lock down. That was just, again, we did the same thing in the United States in 1919 that we did in 2020 with almost precisely the same result, which was an unchecked spread of the pandemic through the United States at that time and now.
Yes, but back in the 1918, there were like conditions that soldiers faced during the war. There were not enough food, and these sort of conditions sort of escalated the spread of the disease. While meanwhile, in the 2020s, we don't have a war, luckily, or something to differ. It's just a pandemic that we have to only take the personal responsibility to not spread the disease or make the disease spreadable to one another, to another person, because they might suffer and have a possibility of dying just because of it.
You're absolutely right. In 1919, it was almost a perfect storm of, trench warfare, of a lot of movement of people, across, in crowded boats,
Yes.
across an ocean to fight in crowded places and then come back
Yes.
and get on crowded trains to go to crowded cities. What was interesting, Rashni, is that some of the same strategies, when you read the 1919 pandemic and the 2020 pandemic, some of the same discussions were at play from the epidemiologist at the time. Limit social gatherings, close churches, close schools, wear masks.
Yes.
All of those same sort of things were in both as the kind of the front line of defense from an epidemiology perspective. The same thing that the Greeks and the Romans understood about pandemics. Crowded places seem to be a problem. Just that kind of basic observation, and the basic observation that it was a respiratory disease. So wearing masks was a simple mitigation strategy. What was interesting from a communications perspective is that people still struggled with that message, at least in the United States, in 1919 and 2020. There was a group of people, and you could see there were posters all over in 1919 about wearing masks and social distancing, and there were protests against it then, as there are now. I'm not sure if that's something unique to the character of the United States, but it's funny how the first response to the flu from epidemiologists was so similar 100 years later. And, obviously in 1919, 1920, there was no vaccine nor a hope of a vaccine coming in 12 months. So that is a unique feature of 2020.
Yes, yeah. And also I would like to say that, during that time, I would say that we didn't have any technology or some sort. Our bodies would adapt to the situation, and we had to learn that, okay, now the flu is like a curable disease to some humans who have the ability, who have a very strong immune system and who have the fate to live longer. So that also plays a toll. It's we have got adapted, our bodies have got adapted to fight the disease itself within our bodies.
Yeah, it's absolutely. And in 1919, that was the only choice, of course, was kind of natural immunity and having the disease and surviving it. My grandmother was one of those people who used to tell that story. And I opened the chapter with her story. She and her brother at the time were very ill, and caught the disease from a traveling salesperson that went through their small town. And many, about 10 to 15% of the population in her small town died from the flu.
Yes.
At that time. My grandmother and her brother nearly did. So in addition to natural immunity, the kind of ability of physicians to have ventilators, to have, to understand kind of that, not only germ theory of disease that was not 100% accepted in 1919, but that we understood what we were facing today, and use a data-centric approach to help us understand what's going on, what are the best treatment modalities, what drugs may or may not work, how are they tested, and then obviously vaccine development as well played a role.
Yeah, it didn't take until the 1940s for the first generation of mechanical ventilators to become available. And how they developed the vaccine was the first flu vaccine was used to fertilize chicken eggs. And that is still used to produce some of the flu vaccines today. And it first started from an inactivated influenza A virus, and then slowly it developed to them taking a sample of an inactive form of influenza B virus. And this is how kind of the science part of the whole pandemic, how they actually came up with the solution for the influenza.
I think when you take a look at history, and I have the opportunity to cover multiple aspects of health as part of the book. Health is a part of the story for many leaders throughout history. Napoleon famously suffered from a number of health ailments. Leaders throughout time had United States presidents certainly are no exception to that. And what was interesting to me about the implications of what of the flu on a very specific, how does that elevate to the highest levels? Woodrow Wilson had the flu himself and was so ill during the negotiation for the League of Nations, wasn't really able to participate in those negotiations and lend his voice to help push that through. And essentially one of the key reasons the League of Nations failed to materialize at the end of World War I, which in many ways led to World War II. I think hundreds of years later, we will look back at those two conflicts as one conflict. But he wasn't able to do that. And as he was back in the United States, he suffered a stroke after coming back, trying to take a tour to promote the League of Nations, had a stroke, had to step away from that promotion. And his opponents, isolationist opponents in the Senate, were able to stop any ratification of the League of Nations, which essentially doomed it to failure and led very directly to the rise of Nazi Germany and Imperial Japan.
Yeah, so it's really interesting how his strategy and how he tried to do it, because it was a first time experience for him.
I think it's interesting when you read ancient history, when you read history before germ theory of disease, before antibiotics, before antivirals, before again the wide acceptance of vaccines as medical treatments. You see leaders that when you read the primary source documents and you read their journals, you read their diaries, you see health as a constant, fearful companion, where people were terrified of polio, they're terrified of the flu, terrified of plagues, and that every parent had experience of having multiple children, and nearly every parent had lost one or more of them. So it was really a constant companion. When we read history, we tend to gloss over all of those details. We don't talk about them. We talk about the generals in the battles or the politics or these big agreements. But when you read their day-to-day life, it was a terrifying kind of companion. Doctors were not a profession that carried a lot of the same kind of respect they do now, because they frankly didn't have the tools they do now to treat illness, and they didn't have the same kind of scientific approach that happens now. And it's fascinating to actually read those documents and hear people be in abject terror of catching the flu because they knew how dangerous it was, and they knew that they wouldn't go to the hospitals. The hospital is where you went to die, and they would rather die at home.
Yeah, and it was I don't know whether people still read of how they actually took care of health before science. It was all plans. It was like all about having a huge mental well-being, where you feel like you're not being controlled. You feel like you don't have, these chains all over you. And that is the source normally of mental struggles, mental health issues. And that's why you have kind of stress. and you feel like you're in this kind of routine every day. And sometimes you think that this type of routine is like too much for you to handle at all at once. And they say that if you have a clear mind, you will live longer because it all starts with your mind. If you're not scared of the like disease, or you won't, there's a possibility of over 99% that you won't contract every disease that is there available in this earth.
Yeah, the links between mental health, psychology, physical health, and kind of biology are really in their infancies in many ways, in terms of just understanding the linkages between those things and how our mental state and how we feel about things projects onto our health itself. And where is the line between what we can impact from our own mental health perspective and what's more psychology, what's more physiology. And that there's not a bright line between those things. There's a blur, and it's a really fascinating area of research right now that I find fascinating. I'm just a naturally curious person and love to learn about things and love to tell other stories. But that's a really fascinating one, and I try to follow the research as best I can on what science is learning about that. It's really cool stuff.
Yeah, and you also have like launch medical devices or virtual healthcare systems. Can you please talk about that as well?
Yeah, I think one of the things that I'm most interested in, I've launched a number of medical devices, cardiac devices, implantables, wearable devices. One of the things I'm most interested in is the work that I've done on medication adherence. One of the big issues as folks age is the number of medications that come into their life that need to be taken consistently at the same time each day. And that's at the same time that many people are losing some of the cognitive faculties to be able to remember to do that. So some of the most fascinating projects I've worked on have been those that meld kind of the biology with the psychology and behavioral metrics. How do we remind people to take medications at the right time? How do we make them feel good about that? How do we, share that data with the caregivers and with the physicians so that we have that data that then can be, really looked at beyond the clinical trial data where the drugs were approved, that long-term use data when you have, okay, someone has been taking drug X for this long, here's exactly when they took it, exactly how they took it. We can begin to draw better conclusions about medication efficacy if we have better data about adherence and actually taking that medication, again, beyond the clinical trial data that might have been done years or decades before. So those have been fascinating. Innumerable challenges in doing that around data privacy, data collection, data storage. It's mostly kind of a data question rather than the biology wasn't very difficult. The mechanics weren't very difficult. It was all about data. And I think that's where, when you look at medical device development today, one of the most fascinating areas is how you collect better data and how you use that data. It's the biggest challenge today in medical device development and launch is the hardware is still challenging, the software is still challenging, but now the data has become really the next great frontier in medicine. And that's what's really fascinating to me as I work in professional practice.
That's awesome. And also, I would, do you have any new innovative products you've released, especially during COVID-19, since the situation is that like people who are not vaccinated are like being treated last, and what if they want to see a physician then? And there has been like situations like that arising. So did you come up with any new innovative products? Like I was thinking that people would come up with a machine that kind of works like a physician, like so they just type in what all their like symptoms, and like the device kind of like tells them this is what is actually going on and in your body.
What has been really interesting is all of the testing technology. The nasal swabs, saliva swabs, things like that. All that technology is pretty well understood. And we have the different reliabilities. The key thing that I spent time working with a few clients on over the pandemic has been, how do you develop the testing regimens to be able to catch infection clusters early? That's especially important in the United States, especially with senior care facilities. Senior care facilities are essentially, to your listeners who may not be familiar with them, they're a little bit of a United States invention. They exist around the rest of the world as well, but they're essentially group homes where seniors, 65 years of age and older, will live together in like a kind of a large apartment building. That apartment building will have independent living, essentially apartments or flats, assisted living, where nurses will come in, and then memory care for folks with cognitive issues and more, advanced nursing needs. All of those people who are vulnerable to COVID-19 and respiratory viruses live in the same place. You couldn't think of a more perfect place for that to spread. So what was interesting over the pandemic was working on, how do we catch an infection before it spreads to the entire facility? And really, the answer is something really old. It's consistent, simple testing. So instead of the days-long nasal swab 3 days later, when you use like a Bayesian approach to the statistics, you would say, okay, we're going to do the simpler saliva swab. Its accuracy is lower, but we can do the test much more often, and we can test multiple times a day, and we can catch possible infections. Even though the accuracy is low, we can find where the cluster might be starting, isolate that group, test more rigorously, and then you really know you can increase the probability of, eliminate false positives by repeat testing. But that repeat testing has saved innumerable lives for those organizations that have implemented that. And in the United States, where they didn't, it's been some of the most tragic episodes in our history. Is an unconscionable irresponsibility for organizations that have allowed the pandemic to spread and rip through those kind of facilities where the fatality rate is saddening, 15, 20, 25% of residents contracting and dying of the disease, where, consistent testing, very old ideas, ideas Woodrow Wilson would have understood, an epidemiologist at that time would have understood. Testing, isolation, those sort of really old ideas, and how do we use technology to help us collect that data and map it and do it more quickly and more efficiently with fewer people. That's really been the thing I've been most excited about over the last 18 months of working with clients on trying to develop and implement those systems.
Yeah, that is cool. So another question is, now we're moving to politics, because you had the whole book written on it. So who are the best US presidents and the worst, according to you?
I think there are a couple of ways to look at best. US presidents. And what I mean by that is, there can be best from a, from a politics perspective, where they achieve their goals. And there can be best from kind of what I would say is a marketing and how they communicated kind of perspective. So let me talk about some of the best and kind of the 5 best in my opinion. Calvin Coolidge, Harry Truman, James Madison, Ronald Reagan, and James Polk. And let me just talk about just one of those that your listeners may not, A, may never have heard of, and B, wouldn't really, probably wouldn't, go in and wouldn't think about him in this way. And that's Calvin Coolidge. Okay. Calvin Coolidge was president in the 1920s, an era of United States history, kind of between the wars, high price prosperity time in the United States.
So it's like, I think Calvin Coolidge was like after Herbert Hoover, like after the Depression, right?
Calvin Coolidge was before Herbert Hoover.
Okay, before.
Yeah. So after Woodrow Wilson, after Warren Harding, then Calvin Coolidge. Calvin Coolidge became president when Warren Harding died in office. So Calvin Coolidge became president and then was elected again during what the United States historians call the Roaring 20s. High prosperity, a lot of excitement and energy, very much like the 1990s in, kind of worldwide, great prosperity. People look at Calvin Coolidge and they think he's a dour person, very stoic, but what people don't realize is that this was exactly the same time when consumer marketing was just taking off in the United States and around the world. The most notable was the Sears catalog. Sears, which is kind of no longer exists. The biggest innovation at the time in marketing was the catalog. That anyone could get this big catalog anywhere in the country, that the post office could go and get any product anywhere. It was the Amazon of its time. It was just, it is impossible to understate how big of a deal that was. So advertising professionals were just starting to understand how to market a product, how to have the features and how to trick our psychology into buying something that maybe we didn't need before, and how to create demand. Well, advertising pioneer Bruce Barton, who was one of the founders of BBDO in New York, partnered with Calvin Coolidge to create the modern political marketing machine. So how candidates were crafted as like they were products. What features did Calvin Coolidge have? What messages did he have? What was his marketing strategy with, with female voters who just got the right to vote in his first election? That wasn't the case in the United States before. Only men could vote. Well, there's a whole new group. 50% of the population could now vote. Would they vote like men? Probably not. Bruce Barton helped coach Calvin Coolidge to create messages that would appeal to women, that would appeal to African-American voters, that would appeal to rural or urban voters, and crafted his image as if Calvin Coolidge were a product. It has been essentially that way ever since. Before Calvin Coolidge, politics and elections and everything weren't something that the average person really, there wasn't kind of a product view to that. After Calvin Coolidge, politics completely changed. And if there's one story that's important to understand, if you want to think about like, boy, I hate how politics is today, it started right there in terms of how it is today is essentially Bruce Barton's invention. It's a fascinating story. So it's one of my favorites in the whole book, kind of in the middle of the book though. So you got to get to the middle.
Yeah, I would like to read your book because I'm interested in the presidency as well. And thank you. You reminded me that Calvin Coolidge was like before Herbert Hoover, then it was Franklin Delano Roosevelt, right?
That's right. Yep. Herbert Hoover's an interesting story in and of himself. Most people feel that he was a failure for essentially guiding the United States and the rest of the world into the Great Depression. But what most people don't know about Herbert Hoover is he was one of the most interesting, dynamic humanitarians in world history. In Belgium, for instance, they still celebrate Herbert Hoover because during World War I, Herbert Hoover he set up the system that basically took grain and corn and wheat from the United States and got it to Belgium because Belgium was under German occupation. And the Germans were content to let the Belgians starve, but Herbert Hoover figured out a way to get them, to get the food in and keep the population alive, probably saved 10 million lives. It's something that we kind of forget because we remember Herbert Hoover because of the Great Depression.
Yes, Great Depression.
But,
and people think that he didn't do much for the Depression. He just thought that it would go away by itself.
Right, which couldn't be further from the truth. There are many of the programs that Franklin Roosevelt implemented and expanded actually were begun during Herbert Hoover's presidency. And it's one of those things that it's funny from a communicator's perspective like mine. I've always been fascinated in how people remember things. And they're one of those kind of well-known psychological issues is when people will remember the last thing that happened, or they'll remember the biggest event, yes, and it will cause them to kind of forget all of the things that kind of led up to that. Herbert Hoover is a perfect example of that psychology, where we remember him because that's the last thing that happened, and that's the biggest thing. But if you were to ask people at that time, especially if you were to ask people in 1928, who is the best statesman in the United States, who's the best politician, who is who is the best person, they probably would have told you Herbert Hoover. Yeah. He was as popular as it was popular for a politician to be.
He was the best one, you think?
I think he certainly was not the best president. Yeah. Just because of the circumstances, and that's where circumstances can overtake even the best person. But I sometimes wonder if Herbert Hoover would have been elected instead of Calvin Coolidge, what kind of change that would have been, because it may have been a lot longer before we had advertising and promotion kind of inject themselves into the political arena. I don't think it would have ever not happened, but could it have happened differently? Herbert Hoover was a very different person than Calvin Coolidge and had a very different approach. He was collaborative. He brought people together. The more I read about him, the more I think that he would have made a better president than he's certainly in my top tier for the people that just his mindset and his approach would have made one of the best presidents. But when the world falls apart around you, yes, it can be very difficult if you get unlucky. That's unfortunate. So the arrow of time only goes in one direction. So, yes, we can't go backwards, but it's an interesting what if.
Yeah, and I did not know some of this information, so you're educating me as well through this. So what about Biden? What advice would you give him?
I think that our current president's situation is so different than those who came before him. In the book, I talk about the American idea as an innovation, as something that and innovations go through life cycles like all technologies do. And we're in a stage right now in the evolution of the idea of the United States, kind of crafted, back in the 1780s. And it's in a different place now. And the advice I would give to President Biden today is that the idea needs to be renewed and disrupted. This is very much like a technology question. The disruptive innovation is happening all over. We see it every day. Amazon disrupted, Walmart disrupted retail. We see disruption all around us, so we're familiar with it. The entire idea of the United States needs kind of that disruption and renewal and kind of rethinking. And the advice to Biden today would be, how do you lead through that? How do you make sure that people are having those conversations about the future of work, the future of what's the role of, kind of government and people? What's the role of, race, identity, and ethnicity? What is the role of immigration? What is, the role of economics? All of those things should be on the table for kind of a rethinking. That doesn't mean that, disruption is messy, it's difficult, but trying to kind of keep things the way they were or make America great again, kind of from the previous administration, is exactly the wrong strategy. To kind of keep things the way they are is trying to keep Sears open. You need to rethink it. That's what Amazon did. Amazon rethought Sears' business model and created a new one. Well, if the United States doesn't rethink its model, it risks being like Sears, eventually just kind of declining and going away. But Biden has the opportunity to lead through that and think, change the direction. And it's going to take some courage to do that. Is he up to that? I don't know. He's there've been some good signs. There have been some other things that have been maybe a little bit too slow. It's tricky. I'm not sure I would do better. It's a tough job.
It is, and he has a huge responsibility on his shoulders because he's in that position. Has he ever handled a job similar to this? I don't think so.
No, it's difficult. Politicians are funny people, especially career politicians like Joe Biden. Where have they ever needed to guide an organization through a disruption and reinvention? Because that's really the challenge right now. That's a difficult thing. Might it have been better to elect someone who had done that before? Someone who had, maybe an organizational or a business leader who could have done that. I think that was part of the hope from some groups with Donald Trump back in 2016, is that he was not a career politician. He was a business person. Unfortunately, instead of kind of that, disruption and renewal and how do we do something new and different, it was very much about keeping the status quo and keeping things the way they were, which unfortunately at this point in our history is the wrong approach.
Yes,
I think we missed that opportunity.
We need to adapt every single year, I think, because we are heading towards a completely different new era, especially during this pandemic.
Right. Well, think about not only the pandemic, but think about the rise of cryptocurrencies.
Yes.
Most people think about that as kind of like, oh, that's just a technical thing, or that's just like, oh, that's for speculators and bubbles and all that stuff. What it really represents, though, is a fundamental shift on how economics happens. Instead of economics being tied to a government, they're tied to they're tied to software and tied to kind of, the internet, which is a global phenomenon, not a United States or China or Germany or France or South Africa or Brazil. It's global and it doesn't care about the borders. That's a big deal. What if the United States government, or what if no government controlled money anymore? Yeah. What happens then? I think that's what we're talking about. That's the challenge Joe Biden faces, is we need to envision a world and a relationship that people have with their government that may not be based on geography, and it may not be based on money. It may not be based on political parties. It's really different. What is that? I don't know what it is, but people like Joe Biden need to help us, lead us through that. And that's my challenge with him, is I don't see a lot of evidence that he knows how to do that or has a vision for that. I hope I'm wrong.
Yeah.
Because we need him to be right. Just
Yeah.
in the same way we needed Donald Trump to be right, the same way we needed Barack Obama to be right. We needed that. And it's going to be a messy transition either way. We need strong leaders to help us through that, who are positive, and who can help cast a vision of the future that is better than what it was today. More in the way that and Abraham Lincoln was able to cast a vision, more in the way Franklin Roosevelt. The key difference between Roosevelt and Hoover was that Roosevelt understood how to cast a vision. Even if people didn't agree with the vision, there was a vision.
Yeah, that's what matters. Like, I feel like if most of the individuals in this world today don't have a vision, and they kind of like do stuff that they kind of like, okay, I like this, let's do this. I think this is
Right.
for me. But yeah, and I kind of learned that lesson in my life as well, because while I was growing up, I was like, well, I like this, I like this, I like to be this. And I really didn't have a vision until I came here. So when I came to France, I started seeing, like, I actually started knowing myself and actually seeing a vision in the future. Nobody actually believed it. When I started this podcast, it was based, it's because I just saw the vision and I wanted to make my vision a reality. So I started this podcast. When I started it, everybody disagreed with me. Yeah. And now that so many things have happened during the world, now they agree that this podcast was a good idea.
Right. And that's the thing. No one will agree. I think when we look at history, and I think your example is a really telling one, that people won't believe you up front. They won't. They'll criticize you. They'll think you're ridiculous. They'll think you're wasting your time. But having a vision is the only thing that will guide you to that place. Otherwise, you just sit around and kind of, inertia, the waves take you where they're going to take you in life. And when we read history, what's interesting to me about reading history is that we believe that we only look at things that were successful or failure at the end. We look at, like, oh, Herbert Hoover failed. Well, we forget kind of how he got to that point.
Fine, yeah.
And we think that because it ended a certain way, that it had to be that way. And that, we think, for instance, in the United States, that no one criticized Abraham Lincoln, for instance, for having this vision of a unified country. At the time, there were huge populations of people in the North who thought that we should let the South, the southern states, we should allow them to secede. And a really big part of the population criticized Lincoln extremely strongly on that, and nearly won. They nearly carried the day. Lincoln nearly lost his reelection in the North. Had he done that, it likely would have been two countries.
Yeah.
At that time. So we think about the vision and we think, oh, well, that vision succeeded. It was always inevitable that it would succeed and that everybody agreed with the vision all the way along the way. That's ridiculous. That's one of the marks of a strong vision, is that people disagree with it.
Yeah.
And that people criticize it. That's almost sometimes how you know that you might be on the right track.
Yeah. Exactly.
You have to believe it.
Yeah, I believed it. Like, I saw a vision, like, in 2020. That vision was like you were living in a book, let's say. Like, if you were living in a storybook, it kind of was unimaginable. And it also was a blueprint for my future.
Right.
And I took it as that. And then I was so excited that I actually had a vision for the first time in my life. Yeah. And then I was like, okay, this is a good thing. And I tried to explain it to like even my parents. They didn't see it. They didn't understand it. And they would think I was ridiculous. But one day they will understand why I had this vision.
Right.
And it happened for a reason. Yeah.
I think so too. I think that's the biggest lesson is having that vision and being able to see past it, even though you don't know how you're going to get to that vision.
Yes.
Having the confidence that only you need to see it, and help move other people towards it. They'll get there with you eventually. And then once you've achieved that vision, everyone will think that they were with you all the way.
Yeah.
Because you were successful, and everyone will think, oh, I agreed with you from the beginning. They'll forget all of that criticism, and that's okay.
I think even presidents go through this.
Absolutely. It's interesting to know each president, when you read their history, nothing was sure, nothing was set. They didn't live in the future. They needed to live today, and the best presidents had a vision of where they wanted to be in the future and work towards that vision over time. Some were successful, some were not, but the best ones always had a positive vision for the future that they wanted to see and wanted to make happen. In most cases, the presidents who struggled either with a vision, they struggled with a vision at all, or they struggled with a negative vision of where they wanted to be, that they wanted to fix something wrong. Usually the most successful ones had a vision of what they wanted to do that was a positive vision of a future world, not a vision of what needs to be fixed. It's a subtle distinction, right? That there can be things that would be fixed along the way, but it's always about what that positive vision is for the future. And things will, of course, get fixed along the way.
Yeah.
But we need to focus on the positive thing. That's what gets people motivated, even when it's hard, because it's always going to be difficult.
It is.
And if it's just negative, people will lose patience, and you'll lose support.
Yeah. So I also wanted to ask you, isn't the idea of being a politician should be authentic and strong, considering on a marketing perspective? And there should be like a kind of leader who would bear the responsibility and keep the country in good hands, in quotations. You shouldn't actually market yourself so falsely to the public as well.
I think that the best marketing, if people think about marketing as spin, or they think of it as lying or falsehood, and ultimately over the long term, that marketing always fails.
Yes. Yeah.
The most successful marketing is you've got a good product, good service, good brand that's authentic, it delivers real value to somebody, and you simply find creative ways to bring that message and bring that product forward to the market. Good marketing is positive, it's authentic, it's honest. People think that a good marketing, like you get tricked into buying something. That's not true. That's not true. Good marketing is when people feel like their trust is well placed. And I think that's the lesson for the president as marketer in chief as well, is positive vision, honest about it, authentic about that, recognizes faults but doesn't allow them to stop progress. That's what makes a good marketer in chief.
Yes.
And that's what makes good marketing in general. When it's about trying to trick people or deceiving or lying or trying to hide something. We're in a world now where there is no hiding.
Yeah.
Information will come out. And when people feel like their trust has been, like they can't trust you, or you're not being straight with them, it's very difficult to help people move along towards that vision if they don't trust you along the way. So I believe, like you do, that the best marketing is authentic, honest, positive, and the other stuff, other people can do that.
Yeah.
Good luck. It's not sustainable into the future, and it's ultimately self-defeating.
Yeah, but do you think that it's possible during a world that we have internet and now it's easy to kind of like nobody knows about you, you suddenly get into the internet and you can easily be tricked?
It's easy to, that's that old saying that you can fool some of the people some of the time, some of the people all of the time, but it's hard to fool all of the people all of the time.
Yeah.
And ultimately, yes, people can be deceived in the short term. No question about it. It happens all the time. It can even feel like it's long term, where people believe things and they think things for a long period of time that are false, demonstrably false, and that have poor evidence. But over time, John Adams, the second US president, had a saying about this. It's one of my favorite sayings. He said it in a court case before he became president. And it was, facts are stubborn things. And what makes them stubborn is that over time, facts and the truth don't change. They are steady into the future. Lies change, deception changes, but the facts are always true north. And over time, people will realize what the truth is. It may take a long time. And not everyone will get there at the same time, but you can't fool all the people all of the time. Yeah. It's self-defeating to try to deceive people. It's only going to win. You'll only get there. It's only going to work really temporarily. And the blowback to that is very challenging. So true north is the truth. And if you let that guide you, you'll do better, not only as a politician, as a marketer. Over the long term, you'll be successful.
CEO, any leader, basically.
Any leader. It's a lesson for any leader at any level. Is positive vision, be honest with people, guide them along, and they'll get there. They'll get there in time. It may take time, but the leader's job is to stay true to that vision and stay positive and stay on that path. That's what makes it so hard. It's not easy to do. It's easy to say. It is not easy to do.
Yeah. And does marketing involve a lot of persuasion techniques? What are they?
Marketing is, there's a big part of marketing that is married up with the psychology of persuasion. Okay? And marketers have borrowed, begged, and stolen techniques from psychology, both at the individual level and at the group level. One of the best ways to kind of think about that is marketers take advantage of, and they look at cognitive biases, are one of the most fruitful ways that we look at persuasion strategies. We talked about a couple of those cognitive biases here, recency effect, where we tend to remember the most recent thing or the biggest thing and ignore all the other things. All manner of those persuasion techniques are at play. There's a lot of psychology. If you look at, how advertising is sold to you, appeals to kind of vanity, that appeals to, okay, you're getting older, you want to be younger. Well, why is that? Why is getting older bad? Why is being younger good?
Yeah.
But again, if you're not thinking about it much, a lot of marketing folks will want to will want you not to think about something very much. And in other cases, if you're not thinking about it much, they want you to think about it a lot.
Yes.
So again, it's all about, well, what do they want in the end? They want you to buy something, think something, vote for something. That's the end goal. My advice to people when they encounter marketing, or politics, or information on the internet is think about it as if you are walking into a Walmart or going online to Amazon. Think about the news. Think about going to read The Guardian or read the New York Times or whatever. Think about it as if that website were Amazon. And every story in there was trying to sell you something, because every story is. Now, you might not have to put your credit card in to pay for that, but they want you to think a certain way. They want you to believe a certain thing. Eventually, they might want you to vote a certain way. Well, just because it's not money doesn't mean that it's not persuasion, and doesn't mean that it's not marketing. And when I think about it that way, and I look at a website and I think, why are they writing that story? What do they want me to think? What benefit do they get? What benefit do I get? If I think about it in that way, I am much less likely to be persuaded without knowing it. That's the big thing. So much persuasion happens without you consciously being aware of it. My suggestion is be intentional about it. If you're going to believe something, make an intentional, conscious choice, as if you were, you're taking out your credit card and you're going to pay for it. If you think about it in that way, you'll be more successful over time, and you are less likely to be in a place where you're being persuaded, you're doing things that you don't want to do. That be intentional.
Yes. And also you talk about the American idea. Is that more like even our presidents actually promoting the American dream also in a way?
Absolutely, they are. When we think about the American idea, we don't think about it that way now because the United States means so many things to so many people around the world.
Yeah.
Okay. This land of opportunity, or is it an imperialist? Is it a military power? Whatever the case may be. But if you go back to its core, the American idea was, self-government, laws, not people, no kings, no military dictatorships, nothing like that. That was completely innovative in 1770. In that era, no one in Europe thought that was the right thing to do.
Yeah.
No one in Africa, no one in South America, no one in Asia thought that was completely new in the world. There have been smatterings of it around, but completely new experiment, completely new innovation. And that idea has taken root and grown over time. And it's kind of like a product that started tiny, and now it's this product with all kinds of accessories, and it's got a TV show attached to it and all kinds of things. So the president in the beginning had to worry about just the idea that people could govern themselves. Well, now the president has to manage one of its product lines is its military. One of it's the economic power. One is immigration. There are just so many things now that the president needs to manage that the president did not need to manage 200 years ago. But you can think about it that way, that the idea has just grown. It's gotten bigger. And in many ways, it's gotten a little unwieldy. It's still appealing, but it's got problems. And, that's kind of the idea. That's the perspective I take that kind of underlines the entire book is, what if we thought about it as if you were managing a product line, or, that the idea itself is an innovation that needs to be managed appropriately. So I feel every president had a responsibility and a role there. and some did better than others over time. But the idea has grown whether or not the president led it well or not. So again, sometimes good products in the marketplace can succeed despite a bad CEO. It happens. But eventually you need good leadership. Otherwise it doesn't work.
Yeah, that is true. Anyways, we spoke for like almost an hour. Yeah. And it was great having you, Jason.
Thank you very much for having me on your podcast. I am a big believer in your vision and kind of how you're moving this forward. I think it's a fascinating, ongoing discussion. I believe in your vision and I support you along the way. And I can't wait to see you get there.
Yeah. Yes. I also have like a future plan as well. I want to be someone in life. I don't know. And I think that I was given this vision to actually come to a realization that this is how you get there.
Yes. I'm excited. I can't wait to see how you continue to do that, continue to advance, and continue to achieve your vision. We're all rooting for you.
Yeah. Okay. And thank you for actually joining us. And if you want to have any other topics you would like to talk about, you can always send me a message and we could actually organize a time for that and we can talk about it.
That sounds great. Thank you.